She didn't die in that creek. But for 6 years, the whole world believed she did, including the man who once swore to protect her. They said she ran off with another man. They said she stole jewelry from the family safe and disappeared into the night like a thief with no shame. They said she wrote a letter, a confession cold and final, admitting she never loved him, admitting the marriage was nothing but a poor girl's scheme to climb into a world she didn't belong to. And everyone believed it. The servants, the neighbors, the lawyers, even her own husband. But here's what no one knew. She didn't write that letter by choice. She wrote it with a man's hand pressed against her stomach, against the child growing inside her, while he whispered what would happen if she refused. She didn't run toward freedom. She ran through rain and mud and darkness, barefoot bleeding, until the swollen creek pulled her under, and the world above decided she was dead. But she wasn't dead. She woke up in a stranger's bed, in a town no one from the Ashford estate had ever heard of, with broken ribs, a fever that nearly killed her, and a baby she would have to raise alone without a name, without a home, without a single person who knew she was still breathing. This is the story of Lenora Ashford, the woman they buried alive. She didn't die in that creek, but for 6 years the whole world believed she did, including the man who once swore to protect her. They said she ran off with another man. They said she stole jewelry from the family safe and disappeared into the night like a thief with no shame. They said she wrote a letter, a confession cold and final, admitting she never loved him, admitting the marriage was nothing but a poor girl's scheme to climb into a world she didn't belong to. And everyone believed it. The servants, the neighbors, the lawyers, even her own husband. But here's what no one knew. She didn't write that letter by choice. She wrote it with a man's hand pressed against her stomach, against the child growing inside her, while he whispered what would happen if she refused. She didn't run toward freedom. She ran through rain and mud and darkness, barefoot bleeding, until the swollen creek pulled her under, and the world above decided she was dead. But she wasn't dead. She woke up in a stranger's bed in a town no one from the Ashford estate had ever heard of, with broken ribs, a fever that nearly killed her, and a baby she would have to raise alone without a name, without a home, without a single person who knew she was still breathing. This is the story of Lenora Ashford, the woman they buried alive. The morning market in Ridgehaven started before the sun cleared the pines. Trucks pulled in with crates of apples and jars of local honey. Farmers set up folding tables along the gravel lot beside the old feed store. The smell of wood smoke and wet earth hung in the air like it always did in October, when the mountain cold came early and stayed late. At the far edge of the market, where the gravel turned to dirt and the good spots had already been taken, a woman spread a wool blanket on the ground and began arranging small bundles of dried herbs, a few jars of homemade salve, a basket of brown eggs, and 2 loaves of bread wrapped in cloth. Her name, at least the name people knew her by, was Nell. She was around 30 years old, thin but not fragile. Her hands were rough from work, her nails short, her hair pulled back under a dark scarf that covered most of her face when she tilted her head down, which she did often. She moved with the kind of quiet that didn't invite conversation. She never looked strangers in the eye for too long. She never raised her voice above what was needed. In Ridge Haven, nobody asked too many questions about Nell. She had arrived years ago. Old Marjorie said she was a distant niece who had come to help around the house after some trouble back home. That was enough. In poor towns, people tend to respect certain silences because everyone has one worth keeping. Beside her, sitting on the edge of the blanket with his legs crossed, a boy of almost 6 pushed a small wooden cart between the stones. He had dark hair, dark, serious eyes, and the kind of quiet concentration that made him seem older than he was. His name was Beckett. He didn't talk much around strangers, but when he was alone with his mother, he talked about everything. The chickens, the clouds, the way the creek sounded different after rain. Lenora, because that was her real name, the one she never spoke aloud, watched him play while she arranged the eggs. Every few seconds, her eyes moved from the boy to the market entrance, scanning the faces of anyone who came too close. It was automatic now. She had been doing it for 6 years, watching, counting exits, measuring the distance between her son and the nearest stranger. She wasn't paranoid. She was surviving. Old Marjorie arrived a few minutes later, carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder and walking with the slow, deliberate steps of a woman who had long stopped hurrying for anyone. She was 75, small and lean, with a face carved deep by sun and wind and years of living alone in the hills. Her hands were strong despite her age, her eyes sharp and her tongue sharper. She set the bag down and began pulling out more jars. "You're quiet this morning." Lenora didn't look up. "I'm always quiet." Quieter than usual. Lenora arranged the last loaf of bread and tucked the cloth edges under it. Marjorie watched her for a moment, then let it go. She had learned years ago that pushing Lenora only made her retreat further. The girl would talk when she was ready. Or she wouldn't. Either way, the eggs needed selling, and the morning wasn't getting any warmer. The market filled slowly. A woman bought 2 jars of salve for her husband's knees. A farmer traded a sack of potatoes for a bundle of dried chamomile. Beckett sold 3 eggs to a man in a wool coat and counted the coins twice before handing them to his mother with a serious expression, like a banker completing a transaction. It was a normal morning. Small, ordinary, unremarkable. Until it wasn't. The sound came first: hooves on gravel, the creak of a carriage, the low voice of a coachman giving directions. Lenora didn't look up immediately. Travelers passed through Ridge Haven, sometimes usually on their way to somewhere better. They bought nothing from the far edge of the market. They barely noticed the woman with the herbs and the eggs, but Beckett noticed. He stopped pushing his cart and turned his head toward the road, watching a tall horse approach the market square. The rider wore a long, dark coat and sat in the saddle with the easy posture of someone who had grown up on horseback. Behind him, A modest carriage followed with curtains drawn halfway. Beckett watched with the fascination of a boy who had never been close to a horse that tall. His cart slipped from his fingers, rolled across the uneven ground, bounced off a root, and came to rest directly in front of the horse's hooves. The animal snorted. The rider pulled the reins. Beckett ran after his toy before Lenora could stop him. The man dismounted quickly and stepped in front of the boy before he got too close to the horse. He crouched down, picked up the cart, and turned it over in his hands, examining a loose wheel with the kind of attention most adults wouldn't bother giving a child's toy. "It got away from you," he said. His voice was calm, steady. Beckett stopped in front of him. "That's mine." The man looked up, and the world changed. The boy had his eyes. Not a faint resemblance, not a trick of the light. They were the same eyes, dark, watchful, slow to trust. There was something in the shape of his forehead, too, in the way he stood with his weight slightly forward in the line of his jaw. It wasn't possible, and yet it was unmistakable. The man handed the cart back slowly. "What's your name?" Beckett held the toy against his chest. Beckett. The name hit the man somewhere deep. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Then a voice, tight, thin, barely controlled, called from the edge of the market. "Beckett, come here." Lenora had risen to her feet. Her face had lost all color. She walked toward the boy, quickly placed both hands on his shoulders, and pulled him behind her body like a shield. The scarf slipped, just an inch. The man stopped breathing. "Lenora." She flinched as if the name itself burned. "Don't call me that." The man, Everett Ashford, stared at her with the expression of someone watching the dead come back to life, because that was exactly what was happening. "You're alive," he said. Lenora's fingers dug into Beckett's shoulders. "Not thanks to you." The words struck him harder than a fist. He took a step forward. She took a step back. From the carriage, a woman in a pale traveling dress watched through the half-drawn curtain. Sybil Cross had been engaged to Everett Ashford for 3 months. She had agreed to a practical union, his name her family's money. She did not love him. He did not love her. But she had accepted the arrangement with the calm confidence of a woman who understood how the world worked. Now she was watching her fiancé stand frozen in a mountain market, staring at a woman in a headscarf as if everything he had ever believed was unraveling in front of him. Sybil's fingers tightened on the edge of the curtain. Lenora pulled Beckett closer. "Stay away from us." Everett's voice dropped. "Who is he?" Lenora lifted her chin. "My son." Everett looked at the boy. The boy looked back at him with those eyes, his eyes. The math wasn't difficult. 6 years. A child of almost 6. A woman who was supposedly dead. Whose son? His voice was barely a whisper. Lenora's face hardened. For 6 years, she had rehearsed 100 possible answers to this question. None of them had prepared her for saying it while the man stood 3 feet away, smelling like leather and vineyard soil, looking at her son with an expression that was equal parts wonder and devastation. His father is dead. Everett felt the ground shift beneath him. Beckett tugged at Lenora's skirt. He didn't understand why his mother's hand was trembling. He didn't understand why her voice sounded like it did when the storms came at night and she held him too tight. Sybil stepped down from the carriage. She approached slowly, her heels catching in the gravel. She looked at Lenora, then at Beckett, then at Everett. Everett, who is this woman? He didn't answer. He couldn't. The wife he had mourned for 6 years was standing alive in a market poor and hidden with a boy who had his eyes. And she wasn't looking at him like a woman caught. She was looking at him like a woman afraid. Lenora pulled Beckett's hand. "Don't come near us again." She turned and walked into the crowd without looking back. Old Marjorie gathered the blanket and the remaining jars with hands that moved faster than usual. She had seen Lenora's face. She knew what that shade of white meant. Within 2 minutes, they were gone. The blanket, the herbs, the eggs, the boy with the cart, all vanished into the narrow streets of Ridgehaven like smoke pulled through a crack in a window. Everett stood in the middle of the market while the noise of the town continued around him, as if nothing had happened. A man sold apples. A dog barked. A child laughed somewhere near the feed store. Sybil moved to his side. Her voice was controlled, but her eyes were not. "Tell me who she was." He swallowed. "My wife." Sybil's breath caught. "Your wife is dead." Everett looked toward the place where Lenora had disappeared. "That's what I believed." The coachman announced that the horse was ready to continue. But Everett did not move. Something inside him, something he had buried under 6 years of grief, obedience, and the careful architecture of a lie, had begun to stir. If Lenora was alive, then someone had lied. And if she had been hiding under a false name with a child who might carry his blood, then the story of her betrayal was not as simple as his mother had made him believe. That night, back in Ridgehaven, Lenora did not sleep. She sat at the small table in Marjorie's kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cup of cold tea, staring at the wall. The fire had burned low. Beckett was asleep in the back room, curled under a quilt, with his wooden cart tucked beside him. Marjorie sat across from her, mending a sock with slow, steady stitches. She didn't rush the silence. She had lived long enough to know that some truths need time to find their way to the surface. Finally, Lenora spoke. "He found me." Marjorie didn't look up from her needle. "I saw. If he found me, they can find me too." The needle paused. Marjorie's eyes lifted. "Do you want to run again?" Lenora closed her eyes. She thought of the last time she had run. The rain. The mud under her bare feet. the sound of Harlan's boots behind her heavy and fast, the branches whipping her face, the roar of the swollen creek, the moment her foot slipped and the water took her. She thought of waking up in this kitchen, this same kitchen burning with fever, unable to move, unable to remember her own name for 3 days. She thought of Marjorie pressing wet cloths to her forehead, feeding her broth with a spoon, telling her she was safe, even though neither of them believed it. She thought of the first time she felt Beckett move inside her, a flutter, small and stubborn, like a fist knocking on the wall of a house it hadn't been invited into. She thought of giving birth on a winter night so cold that Marjorie had to heat stones and wrap them in cloth to keep the baby warm. Of holding him for the first time and seeing Everett's eyes staring back at her from a face no bigger than her hand. She had run once. She had survived. But running again meant pulling Beckett out of the only home he had ever known. It meant starting from nothing again, in a place even more remote, even more invisible. And it meant that the lie would win. The lie Dorothea Ashford had built around her name like a coffin. The lie that said Lenora was a thief, an adulteress, a woman who abandoned her husband for money and vanished into shame. For 6 years, Lenora had accepted that lie as the price of survival. She had let the world believe she was dead because being dead meant being safe. But now the dead woman had been seen. Marjorie spoke without looking up. "There's a third choice, you know." Lenora opened her eyes. "What? You could stop running." The words hung in the air like smoke. Lenora stared at the old woman. Marjorie tied off the thread and set the sock aside. "For 6 years, you've lived like a ghost. You gave up your name. You gave up your husband. You gave up every right you had because they told you that you were nothing, and you believed them long enough to survive. But surviving isn't the same as living, Nell. And that boy in there is going to grow up one day and ask questions that neither of us can answer." Lenora's throat tightened. "He already asks. What do you tell him? That his father is dead?" Marjorie looked at her steadily. "And how long before that lie costs as much as the ones they told about you?" Lenora pressed her palms against the table. The wood was rough under her fingers, real and solid. She thought of Beckett's face at the market, the way he had looked at Everett without fear, without suspicion, with the open curiosity of a child who didn't know he was looking at the man who should have been carrying him on his shoulders for the last 6 years. She thought of what Dorothea would do if she learned that the woman she had buried was still breathing, and she thought of Henry, old, sick, dying slowly in a chair, while his wife pressed a cup to his lips and called it medicine. That thought was the one that stayed. Because Lenora had not forgotten what she had heard in the greenhouse that night 6 years ago. She had not forgotten the words that had cost her everything. And she had not forgotten what she had taken with her when she ran. To understand why Lenora feared the Ashford mansion more than poverty, more than hunger, more than a winter without heat, you have to understand what that house was and what it did to the people inside it. The Ashford estate sat on 300 acres of vineyard land in the heart of Napa Valley. It had been in the family for 4 generations. The main house was built in the 1890s, white columns, stone walls, iron gates, and gravel paths lined with old oaks. From the road, it looked like something out of a painting. Visitors often stopped just to take photographs. But Lenora had lived inside those walls. She knew what the photographs didn't show. She had arrived at 23, a bride with no dowry, no family connections, no social standing. Her father had been an herbalist, not a doctor, not a pharmacist, just a man who knew plants and roots and the old remedies that people in small towns relied on when they couldn't afford anything else. Her mother had been a seamstress. Both died before Lenora turned 20, leaving her with knowledge, skill, and nothing else. Everett Ashford had met her at a county fair. She was selling dried lavender and herbal tinctures from a card table. He bought a jar of something for headaches and came back the next day to buy another. He came back the day after that too. By the 4th visit, he wasn't pretending to need medicine anymore. She fell in love with him because he listened. In a world where men like Everett were raised to command, to inherit, to speak, and be obeyed, he had a rare gift for silence, the kind that made space for someone else's voice. He fell in love with her because she wasn't afraid of his house. She walked through the Ashford estate like it was just a building. She sat in the kitchen with the staff. She brought herbal tea to Henry. She walked through the vineyards at sunset and laughed without asking permission. With her, Everett had felt for the first time like something more than the heir to a crumbling name. Dorothea Ashford did not share her son's enthusiasm. From the moment Lenora entered the house, Dorothea looked at her the way you look at a stain on a white tablecloth, something that doesn't belong and must be removed before the guests arrive. Dorothea was nearly 60 at the time. She dressed in black as though mourning and authority were the same thing. Her posture was rigid. Her hands were always still. Her gaze could measure a person's worth in 3 seconds. She had been raised to calculate. Emotion in her world was a luxury reserved for people who could afford to lose. She had married Henry Ashford when she was young, beautiful, and desperately ambitious. Henry had a name. He had land. He had the kind of quiet, trusting nature that made him easy to admire and even easier to manage. What Dorothea brought to the marriage was less visible but far more dangerous. She brought Harlan a man from her past, rough-edged, loyal only to her, who appeared on the property as a hired hand and never left. And she brought a secret that would take Everett 32 years to uncover. But all of that came later. In the beginning, Lenora tried. She tried to earn Dorothea's respect, then her tolerance, then at least her indifference. None of it worked. Every meal was a test. Every conversation was a trap. Every silence was a judgment. "You sit with the servants," Dorothea said one evening after dinner. It was not a question. "They're good company," Lenora replied. "An Ashford does not seek company in the kitchen." Lenora looked at her husband across the table. Everett said nothing. He never said anything when his mother spoke. He had grown up learning that Dorothea's voice was the final word in every room, and challenging it was like arguing with the architecture of the house itself, pointless and exhausting. Lenora forgave him for that silence. She told herself it was loyalty, not weakness. She told herself that love could survive inside a house that didn't want her as long as the man she loved was standing beside her. She was wrong. The first sign came on a Tuesday evening, an evening so ordinary that Lenora almost missed it. She had prepared a mild herbal tea for Henry. The old man had been having trouble sleeping. His hands trembled. His skin was pale, and he complained of a bitter taste in his mouth that wouldn't go away. The doctors said it was age. Dorothea said it was stress. Everyone accepted that and moved on. But Lenora's father had been an herbalist. She had grown up watching him examine people's eyes, skin, and fingernails. She knew what certain poisons did to the body, not because she used them, but because her father had taught her to recognize them in patients who had been exposed to contaminated water or toxic plants. Henry's symptoms didn't match old age. They matched something else. She didn't say anything at first. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself that Dorothea, whatever her flaws, would never harm her own husband. But she started watching. She watched the way Dorothea prepared Henry's medicine every evening. A dark liquid in a small glass, always mixed in the kitchen where no one else was allowed to touch it. She watched the way Henry's condition improved on the rare days when Dorothea was away from the house and the medicine was skipped. She watched the way his hands stopped shaking when he drank plain water instead. And one night, she saved a small amount of the medicine in a glass jar and hid it inside her pillowcase. She was 24 years old. She was pregnant, though she didn't know it yet. And she was beginning to understand that the house she lived in was not just cold. It was dangerous. The night that ended Lenora's life at Ashford, the old life, the one with a name and a bed, and a husband who slept beside her, started with voices she wasn't supposed to hear. It was late. The house was dark except for the corridor lamps that the servants left burning until midnight. Lenora had prepared a fresh cup of chamomile for Henry, something gentle, something real, and was carrying it through the back hallway toward his room. She passed the old greenhouse. The glass structure sat at the side of the main courtyard, locked and unused for years. Dorothea had closed it, calling it a waste of money. But that night, a faint light flickered behind the clouded panes. Lenora stopped. She heard Dorothea's voice, first low, controlled the voice she used when she wanted something done without question. Then Harlan's voice, rougher, impatient, the voice of a man who had been following orders for too long and was tired of waiting. And a third voice, younger, smoother, careful. Thornton. Lenora knew Thornton as a distant relative of the family, a cousin Dorothea had said brought in years ago to help with the estate's business. He was polite, attentive, always standing just close enough to Dorothea to be useful, but never close enough to raise suspicion. She pressed herself against the stone wall beside a cracked pane of glass and listened. "He's lasting longer than expected," said Harlan. Dorothea responded with patience as though explaining something to a child. "It needs to look natural, a slow decline, no sudden changes." Thornton's voice cut in. "And what about Everett?" "What about him? He's been asking questions, looking at the accounts, spending time in the records office." Dorothea's tone didn't change. "Everett does what he always does. He worries, he doubts, and then he obeys." Lenora's blood went cold. "And after?" asked Thornton. "After what?" "After it's done. After Henry is gone. What happens to the estate?" There was a pause. Then Dorothea spoke, and each word fell like a stone into still water. "Everything will go to the rightful heir." The silence that followed was heavier than anything Lenora had ever heard. She understood. Not everything, not yet, but enough. Henry was not dying of old age. The medicine was not medicine. And Thornton was not a cousin. She needed to find Everett. She left the tea on a windowsill and walked quickly toward the east wing, toward their bedroom. Her heart was slamming against her ribs. She rehearsed the words in her head, what she would say, how she would say it, how she would convince him that the woman he called mother was feeding his father something that was killing him, one glass at a time. But the bedroom was empty. She found a note on the bureau. Dorothea had sent Everett to handle a land dispute in the valley, a minor matter, 3 days at most. He had left that afternoon while Lenora was in the garden. She stared at the note. 3 days. The greenhouse conversation replayed in her mind. She needed to tell someone. She needed proof. She needed the door behind her opened. Dorothea stood in the hallway. Her face was as calm as a closed book. Behind her, Harlan filled the doorway with his shoulders, his hands resting at his sides, like weapons waiting to be drawn. "You were near the greenhouse tonight," said Dorothea. It was not a question. Lenora's mouth went dry. Dorothea stepped into the room. Her eyes swept over Lenora with the cold precision of a woman who had already made her decision and was simply completing the process. "Do you know what I find remarkable about women like you?" Dorothea's voice was soft, almost kind. "You walk into a house that took generations to build. You wrap yourself around a man who was never meant for you, and then you're surprised when the house pushes you out." Lenora tried to speak, but Harlan moved forward and closed the door behind him. What followed happened in fragments, sharp, broken pieces that Lenora would carry in her body for years. Dorothea sat down on the edge of the bed and folded her hands in her lap. Harlan stood between Lenora and the door. His presence was enough. He didn't need to raise his voice. His size, his stillness, the way he looked at her without blinking. All of it said the same thing. There is no exit. Dorothea pulled a sheet of paper from a drawer. "You will write a letter." Lenora shook her head. "You will write that you are leaving this house of your own will, that you have been unfaithful, that you took money and jewelry from the family safe, that you are going to start a new life with another man away from the Ashfords. That's a lie. Every useful truth is. Lenora stepped back. Her shoulders hit the wall. I won't. Dorothea looked at Harlan. The man moved closer. Not fast, slow, deliberate like a door swinging shut. He placed one hand on Lenora's stomach. The touch was light, almost gentle, but his eyes were not. There are things that can happen to a woman before she even knows what she's carrying, he said quietly. Accidents, falls, things that nobody can prove. Lenora stopped breathing. She looked at Dorothea. The older woman's face hadn't changed. There was no cruelty in her expression, no anger, no satisfaction, just calculation. Just a woman doing what she considered necessary to protect something she considered hers. Lenora sat down at the writing desk. She picked up the pen, and she wrote every word they told her to write. When it was done, Dorothea folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and tucked it into the pocket of her robe. Harlan took Lenora by the arm and led her through the service corridor toward the back of the house. At the kitchen door, a young maid, one of Dorothea's people, turned away as they passed. She would later testify that she saw Lenora leaving the house alone at night with a traveling bag. There was no bag. There were no shoes. There was only Harlan's grip on her arm and the cold night air hitting her skin like a slap. He walked her past the garden, past the old greenhouse, toward the edge of the property where the tree line began. Then he let go. Run. Lenora didn't understand. He smiled, the kind of smile that has no warmth in it. She'll want proof that you left. I'll want proof that you won't come back. Lenora ran. She ran through the orchard where she used to walk with Everett on summer evenings. She ran through the vineyard rows where she had learned the names of grapes she had never tasted before marrying him. She ran past the fence line where the property ended and the wild land began. Behind her, Harlan followed. Not running, walking. His boots crunched on the gravel, then on the leaves, then on the soft mud of the forest floor. He didn't need to hurry. He knew the land better than she did. He knew where the trail ended. He knew about the creek. Lenora heard the water before she saw it. The storm had swollen the creek until it was twice its normal width, brown and fast churning with branches and debris. She reached the bank and looked for stones to cross. Her foot slipped. She heard Harlan's voice behind her, close, too close, and then the water took her. Cold, dark, a force so total that it erased everything direction, breath, thought. She tumbled through the current like a rag hit something hard, a rock. A root felt a burst of pain in her side, and then nothing. Upstream, Harlan watched the water. He waited. When he saw a piece of her dress catch on a branch near the opposite bank, he turned and walked back toward the house. He reported to Dorothea before dawn. The matter was handled, and Lenora Ashford became a dead woman. But she didn't die. 20 miles downstream, where the creek widened into a shallow run between mossy rocks and old root systems, a 70-year-old woman named Marjorie Harwell was walking the bank at first light, looking for branches knocked loose by the storm. She found Lenora instead. The young woman was caught between two roots, half submerged, covered in mud, her dress torn, her face gray. She wasn't moving. Marjorie waded in, grabbed her under the arms, and dragged her onto the bank with a strength that surprised even herself. She was alive, barely. Her pulse was thin, her breathing shallow, her skin cold to the touch. There was blood on her temple and a swelling along her ribs that meant something inside was broken. Marjorie carried her to the house, a small, worn cottage at the end of a dirt road, the kind of place that doesn't appear on most maps. She built up the fire, stripped the wet clothes, wrapped the girl in every blanket she owned, and spent the next 3 days fighting a fever that kept trying to win. On the second night, the girl spoke. Not clearly, not with awareness. She was deep in the fever, her eyes open but seeing nothing, her hands gripping the blanket like it was the edge of a cliff. "Everett," she said, over and over. "Everett, Everett, Everett." Marjorie didn't know who Everett was. She didn't ask. She just kept pressing cool cloths to the girl's forehead and feeding her water through cracked lips. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Lenora opened her eyes and saw a ceiling she didn't recognize. Wooden beams, smoke stains, a crack running from one end to the other like a river on a map. Where am I? Marjorie sat beside the bed. Safe. Lenora tried to sit up. Pain shot through her ribs and she fell back. "Who are you?" "Nobody important. You washed up in my creek. I pulled you out." "What's your name?" Lenora opened her mouth, then closed it. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then in a voice so small it barely moved the air between them, "Don't tell anyone I'm here. Please, don't tell anyone." Marjorie studied her face, the bruises, the fear, the way her hands went to her stomach before anything else. She understood. Not the details, not the names, but the shape of it. She had seen enough broken women in her life to recognize the pattern. "All right," she said. "Nobody knows. Nobody will know. But you need a name." Lenora closed her eyes. Marjorie pulled the blanket higher. "For now, you're Nell. That'll do." And so Lenora Ashford became Nell, a quiet woman in a forgotten town, recovering from injuries. No one asked about carrying a child she would have to raise without a father, a family, or a name. Beckett was born on a January night so cold that the pipes froze, and Marjorie had to heat stones on the wood stove and wrap them in cloth to keep the baby warm. Lenora held him for the first time and looked into his face, small, red, furious at the cold, and saw Everett's eyes staring back at her. She cried. Not because of the pain, not because of the cold. But because her son had come into the world in a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, with no father to hold him, no name to give him, no future, she could see past the next morning. Marjorie wrapped the baby in a clean towel and placed him on Lenora's chest. "He's strong." Lenora pressed her lips to the top of his head. "He'll have to be." For the next 6 years, she built a life out of almost nothing. She learned Marjorie's remedies, the herbs, the salves, the tinctures that mountain people bought when doctors were too far or too expensive. She sold eggs at the market. She patched clothes for neighbors. She kept the garden alive through drought and frost. And one summer, so dry that the creek where Marjorie had found her nearly disappeared, she raised Beckett with a fierce, quiet love that never asked for recognition. She taught him to count using eggs. She taught him to read using the Bible and an old almanac. She taught him to be careful with strangers, to listen before speaking, to notice when something felt wrong. But she couldn't teach him not to ask the question that all children eventually ask. "Mama, where's my dad?" The first time he asked, he was 4. Lenora was hanging laundry on the line behind the house. The question came from nowhere or from everywhere, the way children's questions always do. She knelt down and took his face in both hands. "Your father died, sweetheart." Beckett looked at her with those dark, serious eyes. Was he nice? Lenora felt something crack inside her chest. Yes, he was nice. The boy seemed satisfied with that. He went back to pushing his cart through the dirt. But the question came back. It always came back. Was he tall? Did he like horses? What was his name? Would he have liked me? Each time Lenora answered with the same calm, careful voice. Each time something inside her bled a little more, because the truth was more complicated than a dead father. The truth was that Everett Ashford was alive, living in a mansion 60 miles away, drinking wine made from grapes that grew in the same soil Lenora's son played in. He was alive, and he believed his wife had betrayed him, abandoned him, and died in disgrace. He had never searched for the truth. He had searched for a traitor, and when the evidence pointed toward shame and death, he had accepted it because accepting it was easier than questioning his mother. And that, more than the creek, more than the bruises, more than the letter she was forced to write, was the thing
Lenora could not forgive. Not the violence, not the cruelty, but the with which he believed the lie.
Because if he had looked, really looked, he would have seen that the jewelry was never missing. That the man she supposedly ran away with didn't exist. That the letter was written in handwriting that shook because a fist had been pressed against her stomach while she held the pen. If he had looked, he would have found her. But he didn't look. He mourned. He obeyed. He let his mother fold the story into something neat and final, and he moved on. And Lenora, broken, hit, and alone, decided that the man who hadn't come for her was no longer someone she could wait for. She buried him in her mind the same way they had buried her in theirs. She told Beckett his father was dead, and for 6 years that was the truth she lived by, until a wooden cart rolled across a market square and stopped at the feet of a ghost. Now the ghost was standing in her kitchen, asking for a second chance that Lenora wasn't sure she had the strength to give. That night, after Marjorie had gone to bed and Beckett's breathing had settled into the slow, deep rhythm of dreamless sleep, Lenora opened a loose board in the floor beneath the kitchen table. Inside was a wooden box, small and plain, with a lid that didn't quite close anymore. She hadn't opened it in over a year. She lifted the lid. Inside were 3 things. A scrap of cloth torn from the dress she had been wearing the night she ran. It was still stained with something dark. Blood, mud, creek water, she couldn't tell anymore. But the fabric was real. It was proof that she hadn't walked calmly out of that house with a suitcase and a lover. She had been dragged, chased, and thrown away. A folded piece of paper, a draft of the letter written in Harlan's handwriting. He had written out the words before dictating them to her, and she had seen it on the desk when they forced her to sit down. When Harlan turned away for a moment, she had slipped it into her sleeve. It contained misspellings that matched Harlan's hand, not hers. It proved she didn't write the letter from her own heart. She wrote what she was told to write. And a small glass jar sealed with wax containing the dark liquid she had saved from Henry's medicine months before the night she was expelled. It was the sample she had hidden inside her pillowcase. When Harlan dragged her through the house, she had grabbed it from under the pillow, an instinct, a reflex, the desperate act of a woman who knew that someday someone might need proof. 3 pieces of evidence. Small, fragile, imperfect, but real. Lenora held the jar up to the lamplight. The liquid inside was nearly black. For 6 years, she had kept this box beneath the floor. Not because she planned to use it, not because she believed anyone would listen, but because some part of her, the part that survived the creek, the fever, the birth, the poverty, the years of silence, refused to let the lie be the only version of the story. She had been called a thief, an adulteress, a liar, a dead woman, but she had kept the evidence. And now, for the first time in 6 years, someone who could use it had walked back into her life. Lenora closed the box, replaced the board, and sat at the table in the dark. She thought of Beckett sleeping in the next room. She thought of Henry Ashford sitting in a chair 60 miles away, drinking whatever Dorothea put in front of him, dying one sip at a time. She thought of Everett, the way he had looked at Beckett in the market, the way his face had crumbled, the way he had said her name like a prayer he thought would never be answered. And she thought of Dorothea, standing in that bedroom 6 years ago, folding the letter, pocketing it like a receipt. Calm, certain, done. Lenora pressed her palms flat against the table. She had two choices. She could run again, pack what little they had take. Beckett and Marjorie disappear into another town, another name, another life, built on silence and fear. Or she could stop running, not for Everett, not for the Ashford name, not for a mansion she never wanted, and a world that had never wanted her. For Henry, because he was being killed slowly by a woman who smiled while she poured the poison. For Beckett, because her son deserved to stop growing up behind a lie. And for herself, because she was tired of hiding, tired of answering to a name that wasn't hers, tired of living like a ghost in a town where no one knew that the quiet woman who sold eggs at the far edge of the market had once been someone's wife, someone's daughter-in-law, someone's inconvenience. She had survived the creek. She had survived the winter. She had survived 6 years of nothing. Now she had to decide if she could survive the truth. Lenora stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark ridge where the pines met the sky. The decision didn't come as a burst of courage. It came as exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that stops asking whether you're strong enough and simply tells you that the weight of silence has become heavier than the risk of speaking. She didn't say it out loud. She didn't need to. But when she finally turned away from the window and went to bed, something had shifted. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. For 6 years, Lenora had let the world believe she was dead. Tomorrow, she would begin the slow, terrifying work of coming back to life. Everett Ashford came back to Ridgehaven 3 days later. He didn't bring tools. He didn't bring bread. He didn't bring excuses wrapped in politeness. He came on horseback alone, with nothing but questions he wasn't sure he could survive hearing answered. He had told the house he needed to inspect a trade route in the mountains, something about a wine shipment that had been delayed. No one questioned it. No one ever questioned where Everett went as long as he returned on time and did what his mother expected. The road to Ridgehaven felt longer than before. The valley floor gave way to foothills, then to steeper ground where the oaks thinned and the pines took over. The air turned colder. The sky narrowed between the ridges. By the time he reached the town, the afternoon light was already going amber. He found the cottage at the end of a dirt path where the stones mixed with wet clay. It looked even smaller than he remembered: low walls, a leaning roof, a garden half overtaken by weeds, a crooked chicken coop, and bundles of dried herbs hanging under the eaves. Smoke curled from a tin chimney. He dismounted and stood at the gate. Before he could knock, the door opened. Old Marjorie appeared on the other side, small, thin, her face carved by decades of wind and solitude. She looked at him without warmth, without surprise, without invitation. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "I need to talk to Lenora." there's no Lenora here. Everett held her gaze. Then I need to talk to Nell. Marjorie's eyes narrowed. She studied him the way a person studies a crack in a dam, calculating how much damage it might do when it finally breaks. You didn't come looking for her when she was dying. Why come now? The question hit him like a stone thrown from close range. He had no defense against it. He had believed a letter. He had believed a story. He had mourned a version of his wife that never existed, while the real one bled in a stranger's bed 20 miles downstream. Before he could answer, Lenora appeared behind Marjorie. She wore a plain apron. Her hands were dusted with flour. Her hair was pulled back, and in the late light, her face looked sharper than he remembered. Older, leaner, stripped of everything soft. But her eyes were the same. Dark and steady and capable of holding more pain than most people could carry in a lifetime. I told you not to come back, she said. I know. Then why are you here? Lenora stepped past Marjorie and stood in the doorway, not blocking it, filling it, like a woman who had learned that the space she occupied was the only territory she could control. Everett looked at her. Behind her, inside the house, he could hear the small sounds of Beckett, a chair scraping a spoon against a bowl. The sounds of a life that had been built without him, in spite of him around the hole he had left. I need to understand what happened, he said. Lenora almost laughed. The sound came out dry and sharp like a branch snapping. Understanding doesn't change what happened. Marjorie put a hand on Lenora's arm. Not to stop her, to steady her. The old woman looked at Everett one more time, then opened the door wider. Let him in. If he came this far, he should at least hear what I saw. Lenora looked at Marjorie with something close to protest, but the old woman shook her head. I won't tell what isn't mine to tell, but there are things he needs to know. Everett entered. Beckett was sitting near the wood stove eating bread soaked in warm milk. His wooden cart was on the floor beside his chair. When he saw Everett, he went still. He didn't smile, but he didn't hide either. He just watched the way children watch when they sense that the adults around them are holding something heavy. Marjorie pointed to a chair. Sit. Everett sat. The old woman didn't waste time. 6 years ago, after a bad storm, I went to the creek to collect branches the water had knocked loose. Instead, I found her. Lenora looked down at her hands. Marjorie continued. She was caught between roots, half in the water, covered in mud. Her clothes were torn. Her body was covered in bruises. She had a fever that nearly killed her before I could get her warm. Everett felt his stomach tighten. She was alone and pregnant. The word fell into the room like something dropped from a great height. Everett looked at Beckett. The boy was still eating, unaware of the gravity of the silence around him. Marjorie rested her hands on the table. I brought her here. She spent days between living and dying. In her fever, she called one name over and over. Everett could barely speak. What name? The old woman looked at him without pity. Yours. Lenora closed her eyes. The revelation seemed to cost her more than any accusation ever had, as though being caught in the act of needing him even unconsciously, even in delirium, was a humiliation she had never agreed to. Everett felt something inside him fracture. For 6 years he had imagined Lenora running away with another man. He had imagined her counting stolen money in a rented room somewhere, laughing at the fool she had left behind. He had imagined her betrayal, her contempt, her shameful death. He had never imagined her calling his name while she bled in a stranger's bed. I didn't know, he said. Lenora opened her eyes. Not knowing was easier for everyone in that house. Everett didn't answer because he had no answer. She was right. Marjorie lowered her voice. I don't know what happened before the creek brought her to me. That's her story to tell if she ever wants to. But I know what I saw. I know she was pregnant. I know she was afraid. And I know that when she woke up, the first thing she asked was for no one to find her. Everett looked at Beckett again, almost 6 years old. The timing fit with a precision that hurt. Lenora interrupted his thought. Don't finish that question. Lenora, you can look at his eyes and do the math. But being a father isn't discovering a resemblance after 6 years. He lowered his head. She was right about that too. There was silence for a long moment. Then Lenora spoke again, and this time her voice carried something different. Not anger, not accusation, but a decision. I'm not telling you this because I need you, she said. I'm not telling you because I want you back, or because I want your name, or because I want anything from that house. Then why? Because Henry doesn't have another 6 years. Everett went still. Lenora looked at him with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and resolve. If he's still taking that medicine, if she's still controlling what he eats, what he drinks, what goes into his body, then he's dying. Slowly. The same way he was dying when I lived there. And I couldn't stop it then, but I can say it now. Everett stared at her. She held his gaze. I'm not like them. That's why. The answer was so simple, it hit harder than anything complicated ever could. From inside the house, Beckett's voice broke through. Mama, can I have more bread? Lenora turned to her son. Her face softened the way a landscape softens when the sun comes through after days of gray. Yes, sweetheart, one more piece. She tore bread for the boy, poured more milk, wiped a crumb from his chin. The gestures were ordinary, automatic, but Everett watched them with the attention of a man seeing something sacred for the first time. This woman, the woman his mother had called a thief, an adulteress, a stain on the family name, was tearing bread for his son in a kitchen that smelled like smoke and dried rosemary. In a house with a leaking roof, and a crooked door, and she had just told him the truth. Not because she loved him, but because she couldn't let an old man die in silence. When Beckett went back to his cart, Lenora sat down across from Everett. Her voice was low. "I don't know what you'll do with what I've told you. I don't know if you'll believe me or if you'll go back to that house and let her explain it all away. She's good at that. She's had a lifetime of practice." Everett leaned forward. "Tell me everything." Lenora studied his face for a long time. Then she began. She told him about the greenhouse, the conversation she overheard, the voices of Dorothea and Harlan and Thornton, the careful language about dosage and timing and natural decline. She told him about the medicine, how she had watched Henry improve on the days it was skipped, how she had saved a sample in a jar, how her father's training had taught her to recognize what no one else in that house was looking for. She told him about the night she was caught. Dorothea waiting in the bedroom, Harlan closing the door, the letter she was forced to write, the threat against the child she was carrying. She told him about running the orchard, the vineyard, the forest, the creek, the moment her foot slipped and the water closed over her head. She told him all of it. Not in a rush, not in tears, but in the steady, measured voice of a woman who had carried these facts in her body for 6 years and was finally setting them down on a table where someone else could see them. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the fire and Beckett humming softly to himself in the next room. Everett sat with his hands flat on the table. His face had gone pale. His jaw was tight. "I looked for you," he said. Lenora's voice was gentle but firm. "You looked for a dead traitor, not for a living wife." He received the distinction without argument. Then she said something that changed the conversation entirely. "And I didn't wait for you to find me." Everett looked at her. Lenora stood, walked to the corner of the kitchen, and knelt beside the table. She lifted a loose board from the floor and pulled out a small wooden box. She placed it on the table between them. Inside the box were 3 things. A scrap of cloth, stained torn, taken from the dress she was wearing the night she ran. Physical evidence that she had not left the house calmly with a suitcase and a lover. A folded piece of paper, Harlan's draft of the letter written in his handwriting, with misspellings that matched his hand, not hers. Evidence that the farewell letter was dictated, not composed by a willing woman. And a small glass jar sealed with wax containing a dark liquid. The sample of Henry's medicine she had taken months before, the night she was expelled. Everett stared at the box. Lenora stood over it. "I kept these because I knew that one day the truth would need more than my word. I didn't know when. I didn't know if anyone would ever listen. But I kept them." She closed the lid. "I didn't survive 6 years waiting for a rescue, Everett. I survived because I decided that the lie wouldn't be the only version of my story." Everett reached for the box. His hands were trembling. Lenora placed her hand over his, not with tenderness, but with authority. If you take this back to that house and she finds it everything I survived was for nothing, do you understand? He nodded. Then be careful and start with his medicine. Everett returned to the Ashford estate that night, carrying the glass jar hidden inside his coat. The drive back felt like crossing into enemy territory, which he now understood it was. The mansion was lit for the evening. Dorothea was in the parlor reviewing the guest list for the engagement party. Thornton was at a side table reviewing account books, with the focused calm of a man who believed his moment was coming. Harlan was somewhere near the stables. Everett could smell his cigarette smoke through the open window. Everything looked the same. Every person occupied their usual place. But Everett saw it all differently now. The next morning, he intercepted the medicine before it reached his father's room. He told the maid, a woman named Jacinta, who had been loyal to Dorothea for decades, that he would deliver it himself. The maid hesitated. Mrs. Ashford said, "I'm his son." Jacinta lowered her eyes and handed over the tray. Everett carried the cup to Henry's room, but he didn't let the old man drink. Instead, he poured the liquid into a small vial and replaced it with clean water and a mild herbal tea. Henry looked at him with confused, watery eyes. "Isn't that my medicine?" "Not today," said Everett. "Today, you rest." He sent the vial to a physician in the city, a man named Dr. Calloway, who owed nothing to Dorothea and had treated Henry years ago before being quietly replaced by a doctor more amenable to Constance's preferences. 3 days later, the results came back. Everett opened the letter in the stable, away from every window, every servant, every shadow that might report to his mother. The liquid contained a compound not lethal in a single dose, not detectable by routine examination, but devastating over time. Administered daily for weeks or months, it weakened the heart, confused the mind, drained the body of strength, and created symptoms indistinguishable from natural aging and decline. Henry Ashford was not dying of old age. He was being murdered in quarter teaspoons. Everett read the letter 3 times. Then he closed his eyes. Lenora was telling the truth, at least about this. The medicine was poison. That night, Everett locked himself in Henry's room. The old man was awake, more alert than he had been in weeks, which itself was evidence. Without the daily dose, his mind was clearing like fog lifting off a valley. "Father, I need you to tell me the truth." Henry looked at him with eyes that held a sadness so old it had fossilized. About what Everett placed the physician's letter on the blanket. About Mother. Henry didn't seem surprised. He seemed defeated, as though some door he had been leaning against for years had finally given way, and he no longer had the strength to pretend it was still closed. He asked one question: "How much do you already know?" Everett felt ice in his hands. "You knew." Henry closed his eyes. "Not all of it. Not at first. I suspected the medicine too late. By then, I was too weak to act and too ashamed to speak." The confession came slowly, each sentence costing something. Henry told him about the early years of the marriage, about Harlan. about the signs he chose to ignore about the affair he suspected but never confirmed, because confirming it meant destroying the family he had spent his life building. Then he told him about Thornton. I suspected from the day she insisted on bringing him into the house. He was born 2 years before you, before the marriage. Everything pointed to Harlan. Everett stood. You let him live under this roof. Henry's voice cracked. I told myself it was better for you. A mother, a home, a family without scandal. I told myself the past didn't matter, or as long she played her part. Her part. Everett repeated. The words tasted like ash. Henry reached for his son's hand. I was a coward, Everett. I chose silence because silence felt like stability, and I let everyone around me pay the price for my comfort. Everett pulled away. He walked to the window and looked out at the darkened vineyard. Rows and rows of vines planted by his grandfather, tended by his father, now slowly being signed away to a man who shared his mother's blood, but not his father's name. Did you know about Lenora Henry's breath caught? No. When she disappeared, I was already too weak to question anything. They told me the same story they told you, and you believed it. Henry took a long time to answer. I didn't want to believe it. She was kind to me. She brought me tea when no one else thought to. She listened when no one else had time. But I was afraid, Everett. Afraid of what the truth would cost. Everett closed his eyes. Your fear cost Lenora everything. I know. She's alive. She's been living in a mountain town for 6 years under a false name. She was pulled from the creek pregnant. She gave birth to a boy. My boy. Henry's face collapsed. A sound came from him. Not a word, not a cry, but something between the two. The sound of a man meeting the full weight of his failure for the first time. A boy, he whispered. Everett nodded. Henry covered his face with one trembling hand. What have I done? What you didn't do, said Everett. That's the problem. Henry pointed with difficulty toward an old wardrobe in the corner. Bottom drawer. There's a box. Key is under the mattress left side. Everett found the key, small, wrapped in cloth. He opened the drawer and pulled out a wooden box. Inside were letters, receipts, copies of documents, land transfer records, and notes in Henry's shaking handwriting. I kept everything I was too afraid to use, Henry said. Payments to intermediaries, land parcels moved without proper authorization, signatures I don't remember giving, names that kept appearing near Thornton. Everett spread the papers on the bed. He recognized property seals, parcel numbers, dates of transfer. Small pieces of the estate had been moved like chess pieces quietly, legally on the surface, but always ending up in accounts connected to Thornton through layers of intermediaries. It wasn't mismanagement. It was theft. Henry watched his son's face. It's not enough to prove everything. but it's enough to start. Everett gathered the papers. Does she know you kept these? She thinks I don't have the strength or the memory anymore. Then she'll keep thinking that. Everett looked at his father, frail, diminished a man who had traded his integrity for peace and received neither. What will you do? Henry asked. What you didn't. He didn't say it with cruelty. He said it with the exhausted determination of a man who understood that the cost of silence had already been paid in full by Lenora, by Beckett, by Henry himself, and that the only thing left was to stop the bleeding. Henry reached for him again. Son. Everett paused at the door. Don't save the name. Save the living. Everett carried the box out of the room and into the dark corridor, past the portraits of 4 generations of Ashfords, past the locked greenhouse, past the room where Lenora had once slept beside him and dreamed of a life that this house had swallowed whole. The following days became a careful performance. Everett attended meals. He discussed wedding preparations with Dorothea. He listened to Thornton review accounts with a patience that cost him more than anyone knew. He met with Sybil's father, a man named Harold Cross, who spoke about investment returns the way some men speak about livestock. He let Dorothea believe that the engagement was his priority. He let Thornton believe that the accounts were settled. He let the house believe that nothing had changed. But everything had changed. While Dorothea organized flowers in crystal, Everett was quietly comparing Henry's documents with the estate's official records. He found discrepancies that no honest bookkeeper could explain. Harvest reports that understated yields, debts that appeared from nowhere, land assessments that conveniently devalued parcels before they were transferred. Someone wanted the Ashford estate to look desperate. Someone wanted the engagement to Sybil and the financial rescue it represented to seem not just desirable, but necessary. Everett understood now. The marriage wasn't about saving the family. It was about creating the conditions under which Dorothea could hand the real power to Thornton, while Everett was bound by contracts and obligations he couldn't escape. He worked in silence. He contacted Attorney Webb, a careful, methodical man who had served Henry before Dorothea pushed him out, and shared the documents under strict confidentiality. Webb studied them for 2 days and returned with a preliminary assessment. If the signatures can be shown to be forged or obtained under duress, the transfers can be challenged. But you'll need more than paper. You'll need testimony. Everett nodded. I'll have it. He didn't mention Lenora to the lawyer. Not yet. That card would be played last. And then Sybil Cross did something no one expected. Sybil was not a woman who acted on impulse. She had been raised in a family that valued discretion, calculation, and the quiet accumulation of advantage. Her engagement to Everett was a business arrangement. His name, her money, and she had accepted it with the cool pragmatism of someone who understood that love was a luxury and stability was a strategy. But since the market in Ridgehaven, something had shifted. She had seen the way Everett looked at that woman. She had seen the boy. She had seen enough to know that the ghost haunting her fiancé was not a memory, it was a living person. She could have confronted Everett. She could have withdrawn from the engagement. She could have told Dorothea. Instead, she followed him. On his next trip to the mountains, Sibyl took a separate carriage and kept her distance. She watched him dismount near the forest. She watched him walk to the cottage. She watched Lenora come out to the porch, arms crossed, face guarded. She watched Beckett run to Everett with a branch in his hand, showing it to him like a treasure. The image should have made her angry. It should have confirmed her worst fear, that she was being replaced, sidelined, humiliated. Instead, it confused her. Because Lenora's house was not the hiding place of a scheming mistress. It was poverty clean, organized, survived, but poverty all the same. The clothes on the line were mended. The garden was more weeds than vegetables. The chicken coop leaned at an angle that suggested it had been repaired many times by hands that didn't quite know how. This was not a woman who had stolen from the Ashfords and lived well on the proceeds. This was a woman who had been thrown away and had rebuilt herself from almost nothing. Sibyl approached on foot. Lenora saw her first. Her face changed. The guard went up, the hands tightened. Everett turned and went pale. Sibyl. She raised a hand. Don't. She looked at Lenora directly. You're Lenora Ashford. Lenora didn't confirm or deny. In that house, they say I'm dead. In that house, they say a lot of things. The two women regarded each other across a distance that had nothing to do with the 10 feet of dirt between them. Lenora saw a woman of wealth and education looking at her without contempt, which was unexpected. Sibyl saw a woman of nothing looking at her without envy, which was equally unexpected. And the boy Sibyl asked, "My son." Sibyl glanced at Everett. She didn't need to ask more. Beckett's eyes answered every question a DNA test would have confirmed. For a moment, the old reflexes tried to surface: anger, jealousy, the humiliation of being the woman who came second. But something about that house, the mended clothes, the small jars of salve, the child hiding behind his mother's legs, made cruelty feel obscene. Sibyl didn't stay long, but before she left, she said something that changed her role in this story. "Last night I heard my father talking with your mother-in-law. They're planning to use the engagement to secure the southern parcels. If Henry signs an authorization at the party, the land transfers to Thornton's control immediately." Lenora looked at her sharply. Sibyl met her gaze. "I'm not Everett's ally. I'm my own, and Dorothea Ashford is using both of us." Then she left. Not like a woman defeated, like a woman who had decided exactly what she was and what she refused to become. That night, something happened that reminded everyone how close the danger still was. Lenora was putting Beckett to bed when she heard it, the slow crunch of tires on the gravel road outside. Not the sound of a neighbor's truck or a delivery van. Something heavier. Something that stopped 100 yards from the house and sat idling with its headlights off. She froze. Marjorie was in the kitchen. The old woman heard it too. She reached for the knife on the counter, a heavy blade she used for cutting roots, and moved to stand behind the front door without making a sound. Lenora picked up Beckett, carried him to the back room, and set him in the closet behind a curtain of hanging clothes. "Stay here," she whispered. "Don't make a sound. Mama, I'll be right back." She closed the closet and returned to the front of the house. Through the gap in the curtain, she could see the shape of a vehicle, dark, unfamiliar. No one got out. The engine ran for another minute, then 2. Then it pulled away slowly back down the gravel road and into the dark. Marjorie didn't lower the knife for 10 minutes. When the silence had lasted long enough to trust Lenora went back to Beckett. He was sitting in the closet hugging his cart, his eyes wide. "Is it okay?" "Yes, sweetheart. It was nothing. But it wasn't nothing, and they both knew it." The next morning, Lenora told Everett about the vehicle. His face went hard. "Harlan's been sniffing around," he said. "Someone noticed tracks near the greenhouse. Dorothea's suspicious not about Ridgehaven, not yet. But she's tightening the circle. You need to be careful." Lenora's jaw tightened. "I've been careful for 6 years." "I know." She looked at him. The anger was still there. It lived in her bones, now permanent as calcium. But underneath it, something else was forming. Not trust. Trust was too fragile a word for what was building between them. It was more like alignment. Two people facing the same direction. Not because they had forgiven each other, but because the enemy behind them was worse than the discomfort between them. "There's something else," said Everett. He told her about Henry's confession about the documents about the physician's confirmation of the poison. He told her about the land transfers, the false debts, the systematic emptying of the estate. Lenora listened without surprise. She had known most of it, or at least suspected, since the night in the greenhouse 6 years ago. Hearing it confirmed didn't bring relief. It brought a weariness so deep it felt geological. "And Thornton?" she asked. Everett paused. Then he told her. Thornton was Dorothea's son, born before the marriage fathered by Harlan, hidden under a false identity for over 3 decades. The birth records were buried in a parish registry that Henry had managed to obtain through an intermediary. The payments, decades of them, were in the box. Lenora absorbed this without expression. "Your mother married your father for his name. She brought her real son into the house under a lie. She's been moving the estate into Thornton's hands piece by piece. And anyone who got in the way got removed," said Everett. The word sat between them. Lenora looked toward the room where Beckett was playing. The sound of his cart rolling across the floor was the only innocent thing in the world. She turned back to Everett. "What are you going to do? What needs to be done? When, at the engagement party, everyone will be there. Dorothea Thornton, Harlan, the guests, the witnesses. If we do it privately, she'll find a way to bury it. She always does. Lenora studied him. She was looking for the old Everett, the one who worried, doubted, and then obeyed. The one who took his mother's word over his wife's safety. She didn't find him. Or maybe she did, but he was standing next to someone new. Someone harder. Someone who had spent 3 weeks staring at the truth and choosing not to look away. "You want me to go back," she said. He didn't flinch. "I need you there." The words landed heavily. Lenora turned away. She walked to the window and looked out at the ridge. The pines were black against the evening sky. Somewhere out there, the creek still ran, the same creek that had taken her under and spit her out on the wrong side of everything she knew. Going back to the Ashford estate was not walking into a house. It was walking into the place where a part of her had died. She could still feel Harlan's hand on her arm. She could still hear the scratch of the pen on paper as she wrote the words they put in her mouth. She could still feel the cold water closing over her head. For 6 years, she had avoided even looking toward the road that led south. Now, the man who had failed to protect her was asking her to walk back through the door that had been slammed in her face. She didn't answer for a long time. Then she said, "I'm not going back as the lady of that house." He waited. "I'm not going back for you. I'm not going back for the Ashford name. I'm not going back so you can clear your conscience in front of a crowd." He nodded. "I'm going back to prove that I was never what they said I was. I'm going back for Henry. I'm going back for my son's name. And I'm going back because I'm tired of living as if the shame was mine." Everett looked at her with something that might have been admiration or grief or both. Lenora turned from the window. There was no fire in her voice, no dramatic declaration, just the flat, exhausted certainty of a woman who had weighed every option and found that the heaviest one was the only one she could live with. "When do you need me there?" "The night of the party." Lenora closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, her face had settled into something still and clear. "Then I'll be there." She looked toward the room where Beckett was lining up stones along the edge of the floor, building a wall only he could see. "But my son stays here, with Marjorie, away from that house, away from all of them. Whatever happens to me in that room, he doesn't see it. He doesn't hear it. He stays safe." Everett nodded. "I'll arrange it." Lenora held his gaze for one more second. Then she turned back to the kitchen, back to the bread, back to the herbs, back to the small life she had built from nothing. Marjorie watched her from the doorway. The old woman said nothing, but when Lenora passed her, Marjorie reached out and squeezed her hand once briefly, with a strength that had nothing to do with muscle. Lenora squeezed back, and in that grip between two women who had survived too much to be sentimental about courage, an agreement was sealed without a single word. One more night of silence. Then the reckoning. The morning before the party, Lenora dressed Beckett in his cleanest shirt and combed his hair with slow, careful strokes. He sat on the edge of the bed, watching her pack a small bag, not for him, for herself. A dark dress, plain and simple. No jewelry, no silk. Just something clean and fitted and honest. "You're going to the town?" he asked. Lenora set the bag down and sat beside him. She took his face in both hands and looked at him the way she always did when she needed to memorize something, as though the world might try to take it from her at any moment. "I'm going to fix something that's been broken for a long time," she said. Beckett studied her face with the serious attention of a child who understood more than he could name. Like the fence, Lenora almost smiled. "Bigger than the fence," he nodded. Then he asked the question she had been dreading since the day she decided to go back. "Are you coming back?" The words went through her like a blade. She pulled him against her chest and held him not gently, not softly, but with the full, desperate strength of a woman who had once lost everything and had rebuilt her entire world around this one small body. "Yes," she whispered. "This time I come back." Beckett seemed to accept this. He pulled away and looked toward the door where Everett stood waiting. The man had arrived early before the sun cleared the pines. He looked tired, the kind of tired that sleep cannot fix. Beckett looked at him. "You're going with her." Everett stepped forward slowly. "Yes." The boy's expression didn't change, but something in his posture straightened a small, unconscious gesture of authority, as though he were the one granting permission. "Keep her safe." Everett's voice was quiet. "With my life." Beckett nodded once, the way a man nods when he has received a satisfactory answer to a serious question. Then he picked up his wooden cart from the bed and went to find Marjorie. Lenora watched him go. She didn't cry. She had used up most of her tears years ago in the dark, in the cold, in the small hours of 100 nights when Beckett was asleep and the silence of the house pressed down on her like earth on a coffin. Marjorie appeared in the doorway. The old woman looked at Lenora with the same steady gaze she had given her 6 years ago when she pulled her from the creek and told her she was safe. "I'm coming with you," Marjorie said. Lenora shook her head. "No, stay with Beckett. I already asked Mrs. Hollowell down the road to watch him tonight. She owes me for the salve I made for her hip last winter. Beckett likes her cats. He'll be fine. You don't have to do this." Marjorie took a step closer. "I pulled you out of that water. I watched you learn to breathe again. I watched you give birth on my kitchen floor. I'm not going to stand in this house while you walk back into the place that tried to kill you. Not alone." Lenora's throat closed. She couldn't speak. Marjorie's voice softened, but only slightly. "Besides, someone needs to be there who isn't afraid of that woman. And I've been too old to be afraid of anything for about 20 years. Everett drove them south in a borrowed truck. Marjorie sat in the back with her arms folded and her jaw set. Lenora sat in the passenger seat and watched the landscape change. pines giving way to oaks, oaks giving way to vineyards, the mountains flattening into the wide golden floor of the valley. She hadn't seen Napa in 6 years. The light was the same, that late afternoon amber that made everything look like a painting. The air smelled the same dry grass, warm earth, the faint sweetness of ripening grapes. But she was not the same woman who had left. That woman had been 24, pregnant, terrified, running barefoot through a storm. This woman was 30, lean, steady, carrying 6 years of survival in her bones and a box of evidence in her bag. They arrived at the estate as the sun was going down. Everett took them to a side entrance, a service door that led to a small room near the kitchen, away from the main house, away from the guests who were already arriving. Lenora stepped inside and stopped. The smell hit her first. Furniture polish, old wood stone floors, the faint trace of wine that had seeped into the walls over a century of harvest. It was the smell of the Ashford house, the smell of the place that had swallowed her whole and spit her out broken. Her hands began to shake. Marjorie put a hand on her back. Steady. Lenora closed her eyes. She breathed in. She breathed out. She thought of Beckett playing with his cart on Marjorie's floor. She thought of the box under the floorboard. She thought of the letter she had been forced to write and the draft that proved she hadn't written it willingly. She opened her eyes. I'm ready. The engagement party was everything Dorothea Ashford had designed it to be: elegant, controlled, and ruthlessly purposeful. The great hall was lit with candelabras that reflected off crystal glasses and polished silver. White flowers, only white, sat in arrangements on every table. The guests arrived in dark suits and expensive dresses, murmuring compliments about the wine, the decor, the resilience of the Ashford family. Dorothea stood at the center of it all, dressed in black with lace at the collar. Her silver hair pulled back, her posture as straight as a column. She greeted each guest with the practiced warmth of a woman who had spent decades perfecting the difference between hospitality and control. She looked magnificent. She looked untouchable. Near the main table, Thornton stood beside a leather folder containing the documents that Henry was expected to sign, an authorization that would give Thornton formal control over the estate's administration. It was presented as a practical measure: an aging patriarch, a struggling property, a capable manager stepping in to steady the ship. No one in the room questioned it. Why would they? Dorothea had spent years making sure every piece was in place before anyone even knew a game was being played. Sibyl Cross arrived with her father, Harold. She wore a pale dress and a composed expression that revealed nothing. She took her place beside Everett and played her role with the same precision she brought to everything, measured, appropriate, impenetrable. Only Everett knew that Sibyl had already decided. There would be no engagement. There would be no marriage. There would be no rescue of the Ashford name through the Cross family's money. But not yet. Henry was brought to the hall in a wheelchair. His appearance caused a stir among the guests. He looked better than anyone had expected. Still thin, still gray, but his eyes were open and focused in a way they hadn't been in months. Without the daily dose of Dorothea's medicine, his mind had been slowly clearing like ice melting off a window. Dorothea noticed. She moved to his side immediately. "Henry, you shouldn't tire yourself. It's my house," he said quietly. "Who's in it?" The room heard the words. Dorothea smiled, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. At 8:30, Dorothea raised her glass. "Friends," she began, her voice carrying across the room with the ease of a woman accustomed to being heard. "Tonight, we celebrate not only the engagement of my son to a remarkable young woman, but the continuation of a family that has endured loss, hardship, and time itself." She paused. The guests listened with the respectful attention that wealth commands.
To ensure that this legacy remains strong, we are also taking a necessary step. Henry, in his wisdom, has agreed to sign an authorization that will allow Thornton, who has served this family with devotion, to take a more formal role in the estate's management. Thornton stepped forward. The leather folder was placed on a side table beside a pen. Dorothea extended her hand toward Henry. "Shall we?"
Henry looked at the pen. He looked at the folder. He looked at Thornton standing there with the careful humility of a man who had practiced patience his entire life and was now inches from the prize. Then Henry looked at Everett, and Everett stood. "No." The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Conversations stopped. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Every eye in the room turned toward the heir of the Ashford estate. Dorothea's smile held. "Everett, this isn't the moment for hesitation. It isn't hesitation. It's a refusal." Her eyes hardened just for a second, just enough for Everett to see the woman behind the mask. Then the smile returned. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "No, this will be discussed here." The guests began exchanging glances. Thornton's fingers tightened on the edge of the folder. Harlan, who had been standing near a service entrance with his arms crossed, shifted his weight. Everett stepped into the center of the room. "Before my father signs anything, there are matters that need to be addressed." The side door opened. Attorney Aldrich Webb entered carrying a leather briefcase. Behind him, Dr. Calloway, the physician who had analyzed the medicine, followed with a folder of his own. Dorothea's composure cracked a hairline fracture invisible to most, but Everett saw it. He had spent his whole life studying his mother's face for signs of approval. Now he was studying it for signs of collapse. "What is this?" she asked. "It's an accounting," said Everett. Webb opened his briefcase and placed a stack of documents on the nearest table. These papers show a pattern of irregular land transfers executed over the past several years. Parcels belonging to the Ashford estate have been moved through intermediary accounts and reassigned to entities controlled by Thornton. Murmurs rippled through the guests. Thornton's face went white. "That's absurd," he said. Dr. Calloway stepped forward. I was asked to analyze a sample of the medication being administered to Mr. Ashford. The substance contains a compound that, given over an extended period, produces symptoms consistent with his decline weakness, confusion, tremors. It is not medicine. It is a slow-acting toxin. The murmurs became exclamations. Several guests stepped back as though the room itself had become contaminated. Henry raised his head from the wheelchair. His voice was thin but clear. "It's true." Dorothea turned to him sharply. "Henry, you're confused." "I have been confused for a long time," he said. "But not about this. I've known about the medicine. I've suspected about Thornton. I kept documents, receipts, letters, records. I was too afraid to use them. Too afraid to lose the woman I thought I loved. But my silence nearly cost my son his wife, my grandson his father, and me my life." The word grandson passed through the room like an electric current. Dorothea's face was stone. What grandson? Henry looked at Everett. Everett looked at the side door. And then Lenora walked in. The silence that followed was the deepest sound in the room. It was the silence of 50 people simultaneously confronting the impossible. A woman they had been told was dead standing alive under the chandelier light, wearing a dark dress with no jewelry, no pretension, and no apology. Lenora didn't look at the guests. She didn't scan the room for sympathetic faces or friendly eyes. She looked at one person. "Dorothea." The older woman stared back at her with an expression that cycled through shock, fury, calculation, and something that might have been fear, all in the space of 3 seconds. "This is impossible," Dorothea whispered. Lenora took another step forward. "No. What was impossible was surviving the creek, giving birth in a stranger's kitchen, and raising a child alone for 6 years under a name that wasn't mine, because you decided I was easier to bury than to tolerate." A sound went through the crowd, not a gasp, not a murmur, but something more primal. The sound of people recognizing that the ground beneath them had shifted. Dorothea recovered faster than anyone expected. She straightened her spine and lifted her chin. This woman abandoned this family. There was a letter. "She admitted I didn't abandon anything," said Lenora. Her voice was steady, not loud, not shaking. Steady the way a wall is steady, the way a bridge is steady, the way something that has been tested by everything and not broken is steady. She reached into the bag she carried and placed 3 items on the table beside the lawyer's documents. A scrap of torn cloth stained with blood and creek mud from the dress she was wearing the night she was chased from the house. A folded piece of paper, Harlan's draft of the farewell letter, written in his handwriting with misspellings that matched his hand, not hers. And a small glass jar sealed with wax containing the dark liquid she had taken from Henry's medicine 6 years ago. "I didn't write that letter from my heart," said Lenora. I wrote it while your man Harlan held his hand against my stomach and told me what would happen to my child if I refused. She looked at the guests, the same guests who had attended her wedding, the same guests who had whispered about her disappearance, the same guests who had believed without question that a poor girl from nowhere had stolen jewelry and run off with a lover. I was dragged out of this house. I was chased through the woods. I fell into the creek and nearly drowned. I was found by a stranger 20 miles downstream, half dead, with broken ribs and a baby I didn't even know I was carrying. Her voice didn't break. It held. I survived, not because anyone came for me, not because anyone looked for the truth, but because an old woman I had never met pulled me out of the water and told me I was safe. From the corner of the room, Marjorie stood with her arms at her sides, her face carved from decades of solitude and hard ground. She said nothing. Her presence said everything. Lenora turned back to Dorothea. The draft of the letter proves I didn't write it willingly. The medicine sample matches the compound Dr. Calloway identified. The cloth is from the night you had me removed. I kept all of it for 6 years under a floorboard in a house you didn't know existed. She paused. Don't believe me because of my tears, Mrs. Ashford. Believe the evidence you didn't know I kept. The room was still. No one moved. No one spoke. Then Harlan broke. He had been standing near the service entrance, watching everything collapse around him with the expression of a man who sees the flood coming and knows the sandbags won't hold. He stepped forward, his breathing heavy, his face red. His eyes were fixed on Lenora, the woman he had been certain was dead, the woman whose survival erased 6 years of safety in a single evening. You should have stayed in that water, he snarled. Everett moved between them. Don't take another step. Harlan's hand went to his belt. Something flashed a knife short and sharp, the kind a man carries when he expects to use it. He lunged forward. Everett twisted, but not fast enough. The blade caught his forearm, a quick, clean cut that opened the skin and sent blood down his wrist. 2 of the men Everett had placed near the doors moved instantly. They took Harlan down before the second swing could land, pinning him against the marble floor while he cursed and kicked. Get off me! Get off me! He looked toward Dorothea wild-eyed. Tell them something! But Dorothea said nothing. She stood in the center of the room, surrounded by guests who had respected her for decades, and she said nothing. Not because she couldn't speak, but because for the first time in her life, there was nothing she could say that the room would believe. Harlan was dragged out through the service entrance, still shouting. Everett pressed his hand against the wound on his arm. Lenora moved toward him, but he shook his head. I'm fine. She looked at the blood. She remembered another night, another wound, another time when no one was fine and no one said so. Then something happened that no one had planned. Thornton hadn't moved since Lenora entered the room. He had stood beside the leather folder, the folder that was supposed to contain his future, with his hands hanging at his sides and his face emptied of everything except the slow, terrible understanding of a man watching the architecture of his life fall apart, beam by beam. He looked at Henry. The old man looked back at him. For a long time, neither spoke. The room was still watching Harlan's exit, still processing the blood on the floor, still trying to absorb the scope of what had been revealed. But in the space between Thornton and Henry, a private reckoning was taking place. Thornton's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. I just wanted to be acknowledged. The words didn't sound like a defense. They sounded like the thing beneath every defense, the wound that no strategy, no scheme, no decades-long conspiracy could heal. Henry closed his eyes. Tears ran down the lines of his face. And I failed every child under this roof. Thornton stared at him, the man he had grown up calling Sir instead of Father, the man whose name he had wanted and never received, the man who had known the truth and chosen silence over acknowledgement. There was a moment when it could have gone either way. Thornton could have shouted. He could have cursed. He could have thrown the folder across the room and told every person in it exactly what it felt like to grow up as a secret, to exist in the margins of a family that fed you, housed you, used you, but never once called you son. Instead, he set the folder on the table. He looked at Lenora, the woman whose ruin had been necessary for his advancement, and what passed across his face was something too complicated for a single word. Shame, maybe, or the recognition that he had been complicit in something he couldn't undo. Then he walked out, not like a villain being punished, not like a criminal fleeing justice, like a man who had been carrying a weight his entire life and had finally understood that the weight was never going to turn into the thing he wanted it to be. The room exhaled. Dorothea stood alone. The guests had pulled back from her like water receding from a shore. The servants, the ones who had spent years lowering their eyes at her approach, now watched her with expressions that mixed fear with something close to relief. She looked at Everett. For one final moment, she seemed to search for the son she had controlled, the boy who obeyed the man who doubted the air, who always returned to her orbit, no matter how far he strayed. "One day you'll understand what I did to survive," she said. Everett looked at his mother. His arm was bleeding. His wife was standing behind him. His father was weeping in a wheelchair. "I don't understand what you did to survive," he said. "I understand what you did to control." Dorothea waited. Perhaps she expected a crack, one last hesitation, one flicker of the old loyalty. She didn't find it. The next morning, a car came for Dorothea Ashford. She was taken to a property in the foothills, modest, isolated, far from the estate, far from the social circles that had sustained her, far from any lever of power she might reach. She climbed into the car without resistance. Her face was composed. Her hands were folded. She looked like a woman leaving for a weekend visit, not a woman being expelled from the empire she had spent 30 years constructing. She did not look back. Sybil left the same day. Before she went, she found Lenora in the garden, the south garden where the light was warmest and the noise of the house couldn't reach. "I hope you get your name back," Sybil said. Lenora looked at her. "And I hope no one gets to decide yours for you." Sybil smiled, small, real, the first honest smile Lenora had seen on her face. "I'll make sure of it." She walked to her car, climbed in, and drove away without ceremony. Not defeated, not bitter, just a woman who had seen a trap before it closed and had chosen to step out of it while she still could. What followed was not a happy ending. Not the kind that arrives like a curtain falling on a stage, neat and complete and decorated with applause. What followed was slow. Lenora did not move back into the main house. She did not sleep in the bedroom she had once shared with Everett. She did not wear the ring. She did not take back the title of Mrs. Ashford. Instead, Everett prepared a small cottage on the south end of the property, near the garden, near the vineyard, with enough distance from the mansion to let Lenora breathe. It had light, a small kitchen, a porch that faced west toward the hills, and a yard where Beckett could run. Lenora accepted it for Beckett's sake and for Marjorie's. The old woman had earned a house with walls that didn't leak and a stove that didn't need coaxing. But Lenora made one thing clear. "I'm not back because you fix things," she told Everett one afternoon. They were standing in the south garden near a row of young vines that had been planted that spring. The air smelled like turned earth and new growth. "I know," he said. "I'm back because my son deserves to stop hiding. Because Henry deserved the truth. Because I was tired of living like the shame was mine. But none of that means I'm ready to be your wife again." Everett nodded. "Then don't be. Not yet. Not until you are. And if that day never comes, then at least you'll have peace. That's already more than this house ever gave you." Lenora looked at him. 6 years ago, he would have argued. 6 years ago, he would have made promises, grand ones, the kind that sound beautiful and mean nothing when the crisis comes. This Everett didn't promise. He stood with dirt on his boots and said something small and true, and somehow that was harder to resist than anything grand. She didn't tell him that. Not yet. The days that followed were ordinary in the way that healing often is repetitive, unglamorous, built from small acts that no one would remember individually, but that taken together changed the shape of a life. Everett repaired the fence around the cottage garden. Lenora planted herbs, rosemary, chamomile, lavender, the same plants her father had taught her to grow when she was a girl. Marjorie sat on the porch in a chair that didn't wobble for the first time in a decade and watched the valley with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had earned the view. Beckett explored the vineyard like a discoverer mapping new territory. He named the rows. He counted the vines. He brought back insects in his hands and presented them to Lenora with the solemnity of a scientist delivering findings. Everett began walking with him in the mornings. Not far, just down the rows past the old oaks to the edge of the property where the land sloped down toward the creek. He showed Beckett how to check the soil with his fingers, how to recognize a healthy leaf, how to tell by the weight of a grape cluster whether the harvest would be good. He didn't rush. He didn't push. He let the boy lead when the boy wanted to lead, and followed when the boy wanted company.
One morning, in the middle of a row of newly pruned vines, Beckett pricked his finger on a thorn. He pulled his hand back and looked at the small bead of blood on his fingertip. "Dad, look." The word came out unplanned, unrehearsed. It came from the place where children store the things they know before they know how to say them. The place where instinct lives, where blood recognizes blood. Where a 6-year-old boy who had never had a father suddenly found the word for the man who showed up, stayed, and didn't leave when things got hard. Everett went still. Beckett didn't seem to notice the earthquake he had caused. He held up his finger. "Is it bad?" Everett knelt down. His eyes were full. His voice was not steady, but it was there. "Not bad, but we should clean it." "Okay." Everett took the small hand in his own and held it with a care that had nothing to do with the thorn and everything to do with the 6 years of mornings he had missed the first steps, the first words, the first fevers, the first nightmares, the first time his son had needed a father and found an empty chair. Lenora was watching from a distance. She had come to bring water and had stopped at the end of the row when she heard the word. Dad. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She stood among the vines and let the moment exist without interrupting it, without claiming it, without adding anything to it. Some things are too fragile for commentary. Some things just need to be witnessed. A tear ran down her face. She wiped it away and walked back to the cottage. Henry Ashford lived for another 11 months. Without the poison, his body recovered some of its strength, but the years of damage had taken too much. His heart was weakened beyond repair. His lungs filled slowly. His hands, which had once grafted vines and turned the pages of botanical journals, could barely hold a cup. But his mind was clear. And he used that clarity the way a man uses the last light before dark, carefully, gratefully, without waste. He met Beckett on a Tuesday afternoon in the garden. The boy approached the wheelchair with the cautious curiosity he brought to everything unfamiliar. Henry looked at him and saw Everett at 5, the same eyes, the same tilt of the head, the same quiet observation before trust. "You must be Beckett," he said. The boy nodded. "Are you sick?" Henry smiled. "A little. But I'm better now." Beckett studied him for a moment, then held out his wooden cart. "Do you want to see I fix the wheel myself?" Henry took the cart with trembling hands and examined it with the same seriousness Beckett had given it. "Fine work," he said. Beckett smiled. the kind of smile that costs nothing to give and everything to earn. Henry gave him the cart back and looked at Lenora, who stood a few steps behind. His eyes were wet. "I should have protected you," he said. Lenora looked at the garden, the vines, the hills beyond. "Yes." He closed his eyes. "Thank you for not lying to me about that."
She sat beside him that afternoon, not to forgive, not to comfort, but to let an old man finish the conversation he should have started 6 years ago. Sometimes that is all forgiveness looks like, not a word, not an embrace, but the willingness to stay in the same room with someone who failed you and let them say what they need to say. The last thing Everett built was a bridge, not a grand structure, not an architectural statement, just a wooden footbridge, solid planks, simple railings bolted into the rock on either side of the creek, where the water ran shallow and clear over smooth stones. The same creek where Lenora had fallen 6 years ago. The same water that had pulled her under and carried her 20 miles downstream to a life she never planned and a name she never chose. He built it over 3 weekends, working in the mornings when the light was best. Beckett helped, carrying nails in his pockets, holding boards, offering instructions that were mostly wrong, but entirely sincere. When it was finished, Everett brought Lenora to see it. She stood at the edge of the bank and looked at the bridge. Then she looked at the water flowing beneath it, clear now, shallow, catching the light. 6 years ago, this water had been brown and fast and furious, swollen by storm, hungry for anything in its path. It had taken her under. It had tried to end her, and the world above had let it. She didn't move for a long time. Beckett had no such hesitation. He ran across the bridge with the fearless certainty of a child who trusts the things his father builds. He reached the other side and stomped on the planks. "Mom, it doesn't move." Everett stood beside Lenora, not touching her, not speaking, just present the way he had learned to be over the past months. Not leading, not rescuing, just there. Lenora looked at the bridge. She looked at the water. She looked at her son, standing on the other side, grinning, stamping his feet on the wood, testing the strength of something that had been built over the place where everything had once fallen apart. She took a step, then another. The wood was solid under her feet. The railing was smooth. The water below was gentle, so different from the roaring darkness she remembered that it almost seemed like a different creek, a different place, a different world. She reached the middle of the bridge and stopped. Below her, the creek flowed over stones that had been there for centuries and would be there for centuries more. The water didn't remember her. The water didn't care. It simply moved forward, always forward, the way time moves, the way healing moves, the way life moves, when you stop trying to hold it still. Lenora looked down at the water for a long time. Then she breathed out. It was a breath she had been holding for 6 years, a breath that had started in a dark bedroom with a pen in her hand and a man's fist against her stomach. A breath that had carried her through the storm, through the creek, through the fever, through the birth, through the poverty, through the silence, through the years of watching her son grow up in a house that wasn't hers, under a name that wasn't hers, in a life that had been forced on her by people who believed she was worth less than the dirt under their vines. She breathed out, and the breath took something with it. Not everything, not all the pain, not all the anger, not all the grief, but enough. Enough to make room for whatever came next. Beckett grabbed her hand. "Come on, Mom." She let him pull her to the other side. Everett followed. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. He walked behind them the way a man walks when he knows he hasn't earned the right to lead, but has decided to stay anyway, step by step, day by day, for as long as the road allows. On the far side of the bridge, the three of them stood together in the grass. The sun was going down behind the western hills, turning the vineyard gold. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called once, and then was quiet. Beckett looked up at both of them. "Can we come back tomorrow?" Lenora looked at Everett. He looked at her. "Yes," she said. "We can come back tomorrow." They walked home as the light faded. A woman, a man, and a boy following a dirt path through the vines, casting 3 long shadows across the ground. Behind them, the bridge stood solid and still over the water that had once tried to erase one of them from the world. It hadn't worked. She was here. She was breathing. She was walking forward. And for the first time in 6 years, she was not alone. He couldn't erase that rainy night. He couldn't return the stolen years, or give back the mornings he had missed the birthdays. He hadn't seen the small, ordinary moments that make up the architecture of a childhood. He couldn't undo the letter, the creek, the lie, or the 6 years of silence that followed. But he could stay. He could build. He could learn to love without commanding to care, without possessing to ask forgiveness, without demanding that it be given. And she, the woman they had buried alive, the woman who had clawed her way back to the surface with nothing but her hands and her stubbornness and the fierce, unreasonable refusal to let her son grow up inside someone else's lie, she could choose. She could choose to cross the bridge or stay on the bank. She could choose to open the door or keep it shut. She could choose to let the man who failed her try again, or she could choose to walk alone. She chose to keep walking, not toward him, not away from him, forward, and the bridge held.